Travelogue continued. One thing I forgot to mention yesterday when I was talking about the curriculum in the Tibetan monasteries. You know, the basic study program, they start out when they're young, memorizing, and they start out with a book that's called the Collection of Topics. And then you study low rig, mind, and mental factors. You study logic. And then for 5 to 7 years, you study the perfection of wisdom, which actually outlines all the paths and stages to full awakening. And then usually 3 years, although it can vary, on Madhyamaka philosophy, and then logic, and then Abbey Dharma, usually for a year or two, and Vinaya for a year or two. And then after that, they'll get their Geshe exams, or they'll go also to one of the Tantric colleges for a year. So it's quite a full education. As I mentioned yesterday, they're starting to put schools in some of the major monasteries, so the young monks will learn a few of the more general topics, but that's still rudimentary, you know. What His Holiness has been pushing for a lot is the introduction of science into the curriculum, or at least having the Sangha learn something about science. And he made a comment during the teachings this last year that I just came back from, that in ancient India there was so much debate because there were a lot of Buddhists who were challenging the Buddhist view, and so you had to debate and be able to defend your position and show how Buddhist assertions were based on reasoning and logic, and they were tenable, they weren't airy-fairy make-up belief things. But so that was a situation in India at the time of Nalanda University. In Tibet, they didn't have that problem because almost everybody was Buddhist. There were a few Muslims, but they didn't challenge the Buddhist beliefs. So their debate became a pedagogical tool, but they didn't have to think creatively about how to, you know, refute other ideas or how to justify their own ideas. And so for centuries, they've been negating the Samkhyas, who, you know, I don't even know if there are any left. Yeah, but it's said to be good for your own mind to think of these things. But now His Holiness is saying, you know, that one challenge is coming from science. So we have to learn something about science and then be able to explain Buddhism to scientists in a way that makes sense. So this began with the Mind Life Institute. In the 80s, they started having these conferences, and that's really grown and, you know, and everything. And now there's several different science groups. And so Geshe Danam in Emory is doing a lot of the translation of Western science books into Tibetan, which involves also the creation of vocabulary that they, you know, don't have in Tibetan language until now. And in January, next month, they're having a big science symposium at Drepung Monastery. A number of monks are coming, I think for several weeks, you know, to learn science and discuss. They're even inviting some nuns to come. I don't know how many. But you know, it's a big thing to be able to learn about this and have some conversation, you know, with scientists. And of course you find many similarities between Buddhism and science, and you also find these huge gapes, you know. And so I was talking with the incarnations of Song Rinpoche, one of my teachers, and that, you know, now the friendship between Buddhism and science has been, you know, kind of going along for a while. And now maybe it's time for a little bit more challenge to come. Yeah. And I think that's really important, you know, because one of my concerns is that people will start turning to science as a way of validating the Dharma, which just won't work because they investigate two totally different fields. Yeah, science investigates the brain and the body and the external environment that you can measure with scientific tools. And Buddhism investigates the mind, which you can't measure with scientific tools. Okay? But anyway, so there's some science curriculum slowly coming into the monasteries, which I think is quite good. You know, something about history and social studies and you know, liberal arts education and other scientific things. I think that's still pretty much missing. And it's interesting, I think, because Tibet was never invaded, and so they never had contact with Western social institutions, you know, like a university. So if you know, in Sri Lanka, you know, there were a lot of colonialists, you know, so they influenced the university system. And you know, now in Sri Lanka you can learn sociology and psychology and history and all these kinds of fields, but in Tibet the idea of those kinds of fields, they're missing in the idea of education, you know. And so even critical historical analysis or analysis of social institutions, sociology and so forth, you know, it's not something that comes in their minds, or at least in the monastic education. Yeah. So they're really in a situation, and they have been for the last 50 years, 50 plus years, of Tibet meets modernity. You know, and it was really hitting me this time, although I've been in the Tibetan community for a long time, of just how traumatic that was, because they had the feeling that, you know, with the Dharma we will never lose our country, we will never lose Buddhism, everything will remain as it was, and these irritating, you know, people on the outskirts of our land will just stop bugging us. But what happened was they lost their whole country and had to go into exile, and really scrambling to try and recreate what they had before. So they're very much in a refugee mentality, which influences the extent to which you can introduce new ideas. Because in Tibetan culture, reform means going back to the past. If you reform something, it means you go back to the way it really is supposed to be done, that somehow got diluted. In our culture, reform means you change something and have something new. So it was quite interesting when Jampa Sedran and I were talking with the monks at the Vinaya conference. I remember in one part when she was rehearsing her thing, she said, and so a new way to look at this situation would be da-da-da-da-da. I said, Jampa Sedran, don't say that. You don't say new way. You say the way that the lineage lamas of the past, the great past masters, would look at the situation today if they were alive, is like this. I said, that's the way you say it, you know, because that's, you know, the way the culture is, yeah? And so it's so interesting, you know, because our culture goes to the other extreme, where anything new has got to be better, which is really a fallacy. I mean, come on, that isn't new, improved, it's often worse, yeah? And, you know, new this and that, it often brings many more problems. But then the other way is like equally as difficult. And so it really made me see how you know, difficult it is to introduce new ideas into the culture when they are really focused on just preserving what they had. Yeah, and that again came quite clear. So I was listening to His Holiness, you know, teach, because he was really, this teaching was specifically for the Sangha, and among the Sangha specifically for the monks. And, you know, his emphasis on study and on practice, yeah. And the last day, he gave a special talk to Westerners. And there were thousands of non-Tibetans there, not just Westerners, from other Asian countries as well. So he gave a talk in English to us at the very end for about an hour. And he had come from having a meeting with the abbots and teachers at the 3 big monasteries. And I was thinking, wow, how flexible His Holiness is, because what he's encouraging them to do about preserving, you know, everything in the study program and the rigorous exams and, you know, preserving everything. And then to come and teach a group of Westerners where he's talking about generally having a kind heart and bringing that kindness into society and our interactions in social institutions. And how incredibly flexible His Holiness is, going from one group to the other and being able to know how to talk to each group, which are on really, really different tracks. Yeah? So that was quite interesting. I also had some time to spend with a few of the nuns at the nunnery in Mungod, because there's one nunnery, and the founding nun there, Thupten Lhotso, she's interviewed in Blossoms of the Dharma. She had escaped from Tibet, and then sometime in the early 80s, I think it was, His Holiness asked her to start a nunnery. And she was like, you know, what do I do? So she gathered a group of young girls. They must have been maybe 10 or 12 then. And His Holiness ordained them. There were maybe 15, 20 of them. There's a picture in their office now of her surrounded by all these young girls. A few of them were older teen, you know, maybe 18 or 19. Yeah, and they started the nunnery there. And now there's about 250 nuns. Yeah, and they've been doing some building. They had a really rough time for a number of years because nuns traditionally do not get the amount of offerings that the monks get, nor the amount of attention that the monks get. So they had a really hard time, but His Holiness gave them some donations, and then they started, you know, gathering from themselves, and a couple of other geshes gave some donations. So they have a new prayer hall now, and they have, you know, some new rooms, and they're aching for an English teacher. Ruby was going to do that, but then decided that she better come here ASAP, you know, before her mind went off in samsara somewhere. But it's nice because the nuns are getting a good education, and many of them have completed their philosophical studies. They couldn't do the same Vinaya study that the monks have because they don't have the full ordination. But they did decide to start giving the nuns the Geshe degree. And so in May, the first batch will take their exams for Geshe. So that's a big thing. So there's 28 applicants right now. They're busy studying. It's going to be very difficult for them because they all finished their classes a number of years ago. The monks who have to take their exams take them as soon as they finish their classes, but the nuns have had several years to forget. Yeah, but His Holiness this last year at New Year's time, where there's the Molam teachings, he asked the nuns to debate in front of him, and they did very well. He was very happy with that. Yeah. So yeah, so that's picking up for the nuns. But it was a very interesting exchange, just to show you what it's like. The Westerners, there was a section inside the temples where the Westerners can sit, and the Tibetan monks occupied the rest of the inside. So the area where we were when we were at Drepung had a number of empty spaces, and so after the first day I happened to bump into a couple of the nuns that I know from the nunnery, and I said, come inside and sit with us, because the nuns never get to sit inside. There's plenty of space, come inside. They said, oh no, we can't do that. I said, why not? They said, oh, all the bhikshus are inside. You know, there was just inculcated into them of, you know, we're shy, we're not worth, you know, sitting in the inside, we just stay put. And I pushed and pushed, they would not come in and sit in the inside, even though there were rooms. There's spaces for them. So this is just to kind of show you what the culture is like. You know, of course, you know, things are changing, but things are changing slowly. And to press the issue of women's equality is seen as divisive in Tibetan culture, because they want all the Tibetans to be united to try and get their country back, or at least to try and get some autonomy. So they're not open to you know, any kind of discord amongst the genders. So it's quite a delicate issue. Yeah. What else to tell you? Maybe I'll tell you about the teachings tomorrow. Yeah. Okay.